Okay, so today is my great honor to introduce my longtime friend, Ron Pendyala. We go back too long, like into the 90s. I have had some of my PhD students were actually classmates with him, Venki, and so on. So we go back many, many years. And if you look at Rom's career, he was actually at USF for many years. And then he went to Arizona State, did Georgia Tech for a while, and now is back at Arizona State, where he's Director of Sustainable Engineering in the Built Environment. Been 3-4 years. we're working on that. But our careers, which have been intertwined for decades, have crossed multiple times. And the most recent cross is with our UTC Center, TomNet, Teaching Old Models New Tricks, which is a joint effort between Arizona State, Georgia Tech, and USF. And so we've been really closer than usual for the last 5 or 6 years, although COVID has kept us apart to some degree. But Ram is a world expert in travel demand modeling, travel behavior analysis. And so it's great to have him back in Tampa, back at USF. We were hoping we'd have better weather yesterday when he first arrived. It's like the one nasty day we've had all spring, but it's worked out. So without further ado, please welcome my good friend, Ram Pendyala.
Thank you, Fred, for those very, very kind words. It is great to be back. So I was here from 1994 to 2006. And I really feel, every time I come back, I really feel like I'm coming back home. So in many ways, this is truly home. And as Fred, kept saying, we've known each other for a very, very long time. That means he's old, I'm not. But indeed, it's been such a long association. I've learned so much from Fred, and Fred did so much of the travel behavior work that inspired me in many ways. So it's been a very rewarding association and friendship. So thank you, Fred, for that. And Shah, thank you for inviting me. And great to see familiar faces, Achilles. I remember from the time as a student here. So it's fantastic to see so many wonderful people. Again, it's been a long time. I last visited in 2012. So it's been a while. But today I have the distinct pleasure of presenting some research we did under the TomNet banner, the TomNet University Transportation Center banner, with 2 of my outstanding students at Arizona State University. So all credit to them. And so Tassio and Irfan are PhD students at ASU who contributed to what I am going to share today. So here's just a quick outline, so don't worry about that. And I'm going to go fairly quickly. Of course, like all good professors, I have far more slides than probably time will allow. So I will go fairly quickly. But the bottom line is, if you look at our mode use patterns over the years, despite decades and decades of all of our attempts to get people out of their cars and into alternative and sustainable modes of transportation, we have literally made almost no dent, no impact of any magnitude, except maybe in some niche locations. And in fact, you will see the only thing that finally got us out of our cars is the pandemic. So that's the one that finally made this dip in the drive alone mode. And you see this green, which is actually the uptick in the work from home. And there's certainly a lot of that behavior that is still persisting, even as we start seeing the pandemic hopefully fade into our rearview mirrors. And public transit, so this is actually only until the pandemic. So this actually ends with 2019 because I didn't want to distort this with 2020. And this is, of course, courtesy another wonderful good friend, Steve Polzine, who has also inspired me with a lot of wonderful conversations as long as I was here and beyond. And once he left, I said, hey, I'm going to grab you. So now he's actually a research professor, a part-time research professor with us at Arizona State University, but remote, so he still lives here. I couldn't quite tempt him with the Arizona heat to move over. But you can see that even before the pandemic and all of that and what it did with transit ridership has been on the decline. And again, despite all of these investments in public transportation and all of our efforts to try and get people to adopt transit was actually on the decline. And you can debate all the different reasons for why that decline was happening. Dr. Polzin will do a whole presentation on that for you if you like, but it was already on the wane, and the pandemic simply accelerated some of that decline. And so you see all of these, negative impacts of widespread automobile use, everything from pollution to accidents to contributing to climate change and so on and so forth. And transportation now is probably the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And with all that's happening with the climate change and the urgency, if you look at the latest IPCC report and so on, we're simply not remedying the situation fast enough. There's a sense of urgency in terms of how can we reduce the carbon footprint of our transportation activity. And so there's been a lot of work in TDM strategies. Phil Winters is the guru on TDM, on travel demand management. So I'm not sure if this slide would meet with his blessing, but in any case, here's just a quick categorization of some travel demand management strategies that we have tried. Everything from HOV and some traditional TDM strategies to really promoting active transportation to, of course, transit and pricing schemes as well, even though pricing has generally been a little more muted just because of the nature of that of those kinds of schemes. But the TDM strategies have largely been futile and ineffective in terms of making any appreciable changes in travel behavior and mode choices, right? So automobile use has definitely been still the dominant mode. And so you have, empty HOV lanes, empty transit. And here's, some quotes in terms of, demand for HOV lanes has started to outstrip supply in some places. Little evidence that large numbers of people have been encouraged to ditch their solo commute for carpooling. And then there's another, giant of the field from time ago, Professor Peter Stouffer, who was here and then at the University of Sydney. So I actually grabbed him back when he returned to the United States. So he's also a part-time research professor for Arizona State University now. He's also remote. But Peter Stouffer, way back in 2004, actually wrote, Reducing Road Congestion, a reality check. At this time, he wrote this paper in the context of trying to reduce road congestion, where we're trying to shift people out of their cars and tackle the problem of congestion. But a lot of what he wrote in that paper has held true, where TDM strategies have largely proven ineffective in getting people out of their cars. So despite decades of efforts, right, to shift mobility choices, why has the automobile reigned supreme when presumably people are tired of the, commuting in the car and, they just hate driving and they'd love to ditch driving if only there were great alternatives available, et cetera, et cetera. Why haven't we been able to really make a dent in this? So let's see what the data says. And so I'm going to quickly report on two studies. Essentially, one is how is the level of satisfaction with the daily travel routine related to the relative amount of driving. Okay, so this is relative, so that's a key word there, because I don't want you to think that, oh, the more you drive, the happier you're going to be. You just drive all day, every day. No, that's not the idea here. This is really about mode share, right? So what's the share of travel that you undertake by the automobile driving mode, and how does that relate to your level of satisfaction with your daily travel routine? And the other one is, what is the impact of ride-hailing services on transit ridership? We're going to focus on bus ridership in particular, given the nature of our survey. And so if indeed, people are ditching the bus, right, in favor of ride-hailing services, and you see much more of a substitution effect, that again tells you as to what kind of a challenge and what is the preference that people have with respect to mode choice. So let me get into this. Let me just quickly speak about the data. So we did a survey, so it's kind of a mouthful, but we teamed up with DSTOP. This was the University Transportation Center, led by, again, a very, very dear friend of ours, Professor Chandra Bhatt at the University of Texas at Austin. And so we teamed up to do this T4 survey, the Transformative Transportation Technologies Survey. TOMNET is the first T for T4. Okay, just to make sure that's clear. But in any case, the survey team, I probably didn't capture everybody. There's only so many that you can fit in this oval, but it was a large team, and I'm very grateful for the efforts of this team. They did amazing work in collecting a very rich data set about the future of transportation and how technologies are impacting travel behavior and mobility choices. And so you can see some familiar names here. Michael Manis, Nicole Manon from USF contributed to this survey effort. UT Austin, Georgia Tech, and here's the ASU crowd. Actually, that originally contributed heavily. We conducted this survey in auto-centric cities. So if you think about these metropolitan regions, so unlike a lot of other surveys that are focused, in transit-rich cities, this survey was done in very automobile, oriented metro regions. So we did Phoenix, Austin, Atlanta, and Tampa, pretty much where the 4 universities are located. Got decent sample sizes. Tampa is a bit smaller, wasn't quite able to reach that target of 1,000. We hope to get there one day, but in any case, overall, it's a very rich sample, more than 3,000, which is plenty for the kind of effort and modeling that we want to do. So the survey instrument was extensive, so had a pretty massive survey with many different sections, but we did lots of outreach and really did various strategies to get a good respondent sample. Here's survey sample characteristics. I'm not going to belabor these characteristics. I just want, and I'll share this presentation so you have it. You can go through and see what are all the sample characteristics and statistics and so on. I assure you, this sample is not representative of the population, okay? And that's perfectly fine. You don't expect a survey sample to be representative of the population. And that's why we do modeling, okay? And that's why, when you do your papers with descriptive statistics, they don't get rejected, just because the reviewers wanted to see a fancy model. It's because modeling actually accounts for all of the biases in your respondent survey samples. So there's a reason to take, Dr. Manning's courses and do all those models. Yeah. So anyway, so these are the characteristics. So this is actually unweighted. So I wanted you to see what are the sample characteristics, right from the respondent sample. So it is unweighted. Here's income, household size, here's the location distribution. So again, lots of sample characteristics, feel free to go through. All I want to say is that the sample had the variation, the variation in all of these variables of the nature that you'd like to see in a respondent sample for modeling. Here's main mode of transportation for commute. And you can see it's not very inconsistent. So while, of course, it's not perfectly representative of the population, it's not completely out of touch with reality either. So that's there as well. Here's some attitudinal, statements that were included in the survey. And one of the unique aspects of TOMNET is we're really trying to understand attitudes and perceptions, and how attitudes impact travel behavior, and perhaps what is the bi-directional relationship between attitudes and choices. And I'm going to highlight a few, right? A few statements here. So most of the time I have no reasonable alternatives to driving. This is on a five-level Likert scale, and you can see 3.7. So people do feel, at least in these metro regions, these 4 regions, most of the time I have no reasonable alternatives to driving. I'm committed to using a less polluting means of transportation as much as possible, a 3.1. So it's not like people are, absolutely thinking about, oh, I'm going to try and use a, sustainable mode of transportation, come what may, right? So it's kind of a measured response there. So that's about a 3.1 on a scale of 5. Public transit is a reliable means. In these 4 metro regions, a 2.1 is probably very much what you would expect, right? In terms of transit services and reliability for folks. The level of congestion during my daily travel bothers me. And again, in this 4 regions, you would expect, yeah, there's probably some congestion and so on. And this was a pre-pandemic survey when we did have congestion and people commuting. And you can see that's at a 3.7, right? So kind of, on the high side. And so you can see level of congestion is bothersome. Public transit not considered reliable. And then they feel they don't have reasonable alternatives to driving. But you'll see the one that has the highest score, right, is that one. I definitely like the idea of owning my own car, right? That's the one that has the highest score and gives you an initial impression already as to what the car means to a lot of people. So we took a lot of those attitudes and we wanted to account for attitudes in our modeling effort. So the unique thing about this modeling effort is not only do we account for sociodemographics and socioeconomic characteristics, but we account explicitly for attitudinal characteristics. So here's the first study. I'm just going to go through it rather quickly. How does the relative amount of auto mode use impact and affect your travel satisfaction, level of satisfaction with your daily travel routine? Are you actually miserable the more that you have to depend and use your automobile relative to other modes of transportation? Or are you actually happier the more you actually use your automobile relative to other modes of transportation? So this paper is just about to be published in the Transportation Research Record, Journal of Transportation Research Board. It was presented at the annual meeting in January. But I assume nobody walked by our poster, so it's fresh and new as far as you're concerned. So why does automobile use continue to grow across the US despite all of our attempts to reduce it? Is it because there's no competitive alternatives? And if only we provided wonderful alternatives, people would jump out of their car and into this magnificent transit system that you build. Or, so people simply have to, use their car. Or do people prefer to, right? Because that is the one that is actually enhancing their well-being, enhancing their level of satisfaction. Could the relative amount of driving people undertake lead to greater satisfaction with overall daily travel routine, which explains why our attempts to shift people out of the auto have proven futile, right? And you have this continued dependence and use of the automobile. Right. Oops, sorry. So here's some data and methods that I can go through. So here the main outcomes are the proportion of auto driving, right? If you consider all of the modes of transportation, what proportion of your non-commute travel, because we wanted to include everybody, not just commuters, right? So what proportion of your non-commute travel do you undertake by the automobile mode? So proportion of driving for non-commute trips. And what is the satisfaction that you're deriving from your daily travel routine? So those are the 2 outcome or endogenous variables. Okay, and here's some of the main outcome variables. So proportion of automobile driving for non-commute trips. Now, you might have said, well, heck, for that variable in these 4 metro regions, doesn't everybody drive? It's just going to be 100%. Well, interestingly enough, people are somewhat multimodal because at least some people walk, and so there's some walking happening. And so you actually see a distribution, right? And there's this distribution that's necessary in order to model this as an outcome variable. So you'll see about half, about 50% actually say that for their non-commute travel, right, greater than or equal to 80%, right, is actually automobile driving. Okay, so driving an automobile, they may be alone or have passengers, but they are automobile driving. And then you see these other, fractions, and you see that there's a neat distribution there that we can actually look at. And this is derived from the question, your frequency of mode use for non-commute trips over a week. And we asked this for 12 different modes, so we could compute this proportion. What is the proportion on a trip basis? Okay. A weekly travel basis. And then here is your other main outcome variable, satisfaction with the daily travel routine. And you'll notice the satisfaction with the daily travel routine in terms of somewhat agree and strongly agree, right? Because you had to rate it on a 5-point scale. So it is an agreement with the statement, my daily travel routine is generally satisfactory. Okay, that's just a simple statement, generally satisfactory, rated on a scale of 1 to 5, and you can see somewhat agree and strongly agree is, a good proportion of the folks, nearly about 68% are in that region. So generally people seem to be, right, 2/3 seem to be satisfied with their daily travel routine, despite the fact that these are very auto-dependent metropolitan regions. However, if you plot then the average proportion of driving, right? So these dots over here are the average proportion of driving for non-commute travel. You'll actually notice there isn't a very clear pattern there, right? So this kind of is, shows some variation, but there isn't a real relationship or a pattern right from this descriptive graph between this proportion and the proportion indicating that they strongly agree or somewhat agree that their daily travel routine is satisfactory. So we thought, okay, we've got to model this and really control for a lot of the confounding factors that impact your satisfaction and how much driving you do, and so on. And so that's where we went with this. So here's the modeling framework. You have your exogenous variables on the left-hand side. Okay, so all the socioeconomic, demographic characteristics, they're all there. And then we have these latent constructs. Just ignore that little arrow in the middle there, that's an error. But here's your latent constructs. We considered 3 latent constructs that capture the kind of proclivities you have, the innate preferences, your personality, your preferences, and attitudes and perceptions. So those are environmental friendliness, car proclivity, how auto-oriented are you, and your diverse lifestyle preference, how much do you like a variety, and so on. And then the outcome variables on the right-hand side of this chart showing the proportion of driving impacting satisfaction with daily travel routine. And we have error covariances. So these curved arrows represent error covariances that actually engender an error covariance among the endogenous variables also. So you do not have an explicit, right, error covariance on the endogenous variables because these covariances will engender an error covariance here as well, okay? And we can go into that if you're interested, but in any case, just be assured we are capturing that correlation between unobserved attributes. So here are the latent constructs and the statements we used. Again, I don't want to go into detail, you can read, but we had a couple of statements that captured environmental friendliness, a couple that captured your car proclivity, your tendency for car ownership and driving, and then your diverse lifestyle preference, your desire to live close to transit and in a mixed land use environment. So these were 3 latent constructs, very much informed by the literature and our own prior work. And then we invoked, of course, Chandra Butt's, econometric firepower, because once you put all these latent constructs with multiple endogenous variables, and they're not linear, right? So they are ordered endogenous variables with latent constructs and error covariances. You need a modeling methodology that can really estimate all the parameters in a holistic, single full information framework. And so Dr. Butt has developed a generalized heterogeneous data model. So it's very generalized, heterogeneous data types can be accommodated in order to estimate. So This is the modeling methodology. Basically, we have a model for corresponding to the latent variables. So the latent variables themselves are influenced by socioeconomic and demographic attributes. So that's what this captures. And then you have the formulation for the outcome variables. And these are the this is the formulation just shown for ordinal outcomes, because that's what we dealt with in this model system for the most part. And so you have error structures that are multivariate normal, okay? And so if you try to formulate, so this you substitute and you get kind of the reduced form equation. And based on this reduced form, you can then formulate the maximum, the likelihood function, which needs to be maximized. The likelihood function turns out to be a multi-dimensional integral of a multivariate normal distribution. And that's where Dr. Butt has developed some very neat techniques, approximation techniques that are actually very, very robust in returning accurate estimates of these multi-dimensional integrals. So we invoked those methodologies in order to estimate all of the parameters in a full information maximum likelihood framework. Okay. So again, feel free to read some of his papers. So the references are provided here, so you can see how some of these techniques work. So the results, I'll just provide, I'm not going to provide you tables and tables of estimation results. They are in the paper. Feel free to check that out. But if you look at the correlation between latent constructs, the results are very much intuitive. So you'll notice environmental friendliness versus car proclivity, right? You would expect that to have a negative correlation. Those who are more environmentally friendly have a less of a car proclivity, and so on, right? The same thing with car proclivity and a diverse lifestyle. If you like to be in mixed land use, you like to be in near transit, you're likely to have a lower car proclivity, so you see that. And environmental friendliness and diverse lifestyle go together, so it just makes a ton of sense. Here's the model estimation results, and so you will see how, a bunch of, variables, socio-demographic variables. Here's the latent variables, the latent constructs, the car proclivity, environmental friendliness, the diverse lifestyle, how they impact the endogenous outcome variables of interest. That's the proportion of driving and satisfaction. So again, I'll let you look at each of these. So the red means it's a negative and the green means it's a positive impact. But what really is, after we've controlled for all of those, right? We've controlled for all of these relationships, you will notice there is still a statistically significant and positive relationship between the proportion of driving, right, for non-commute travel and satisfaction with the daily travel routine. Okay? So that is a first indication that actually the automobile mode isn't necessarily something that is leading to a degradation of daily travel satisfaction, and is not necessarily a mode of transportation that people are just hoping and wishing to shed and get away from. So that was quite telling. So the relative amount of driving positively and significantly impacts the level of travel satisfaction. So mere investments in alternative modes of transportation unlikely to shift drivers away from the automobile. One thing we did find, however, is that environmentally friendly oriented folks, right? So those who scored high on that latent factor, the environmental friendliness, they reported lower levels of daily travel satisfaction. So basically, you got to find those people and give them transit. They will jump into transit. Okay, so you got to estimate the size of that segment, find out where they are, provide them an alternative, and they will indeed be your best market in order to shift, right? And then the question is, well, can you increase the size of that segment? Increase the size of those who are environmentally oriented, environmentally sensitive, environmentally friendly, because if we make that segment bigger and bigger, then maybe we can get more and more folks to shift. But that is also a big challenge. Okay, so here's the second one, which is, what is the relationship between ride-hailing usage and bus ridership? Okay, how has ride-hailing use impacted bus ridership? Everybody knows the answer. It is a net substitution, and a net substitution by a long shot. It's not just, you know, on the margin. It's a pretty significant impact. So this too, there is a paper, and it is currently under revision for, again, publication in TRR, Journal of Transportation Research Board. So we hope to have that fairly soon. So both of these studies, again, in collaboration with the University of Texas at Austin, with Dr. Chandra Bhatt's econometric methodologies, fully invoked to be able to do this. So here's the beginning of ride-hailing services and the tremendous growth in ride-hailing services. So again, the pandemic may have slowed things down, but ride-hailing is picking way back up again. So all of that is happening. At the same time, there's falling transit ridership. So everything you've seen, and again, the statistics speak for themselves. And a lot of the decline in transit ridership is actually because of the decline in bus ridership. So this captures some of those tendencies. So how does ride-hailing service use impact transit patronage? Is it substitution? Is it complementarity? Right, where I actually use these ride-hailing services to access transit and use transit more than I did in the past? Or is it simply no effect? So we had some research questions, what's the impact and so on. And so our idea is, if substitution is the dominant relationship, then it presumably, okay, means that the auto mode, even as a service, right, the automobile mode as a service is the one that's being preferred over transit, right? I want to ditch transit and jump into an automobile where I'm actually now being chauffeured in some way. And so among ride-hailing users, who complements or who substitutes public transit? So this is change in mode usage. So in our T4 survey, we actually had questions asking people, how did you change your other mode usage after you started using ride-hailing? Okay, right, so you can extract the people who use ride-hailing and then ask them, so how did your other mode use change? Now you'll notice, you know, a lot of folks actually said they changed, but not because of ride-hailing. For a lot of the yellow, that's use it about the same. So even after ride-hailing, I still use all of these other modes about the same. Blue is use it less, okay? Suggesting that because of ride-hailing, I am using these modes of transportation less. And then green is the percent who said they're using it more, right? And that would potentially be some sort of a complementarity. And so here are the two public transit modes, bus and light rail. And you'll notice the 17 and 15% who say they're using transit less after starting to use ride-hailing. And here's the small percent who actually say they're using transit more, which suggests that for them it is actually a complementary relationship. But you can see the substitution seems to be more dominant. And so if you take just that little sample, the 362 who said they changed transit use because of ride-hailing, you can see it's an 80-20 split. 80%, that's your, you know, you can just keep that in your mind. It's an 80-20 split. 80% are substituting transit with ride-hailing. 20% are complementing transit with ride-hailing. In Tampa, we have a slightly different percent. We see a greater level of substitution, but I'm just thinking maybe this is a little bit of an artifact of the sample size. So I wouldn't read too much into it. I think the 80-20 is a great rule of thumb, okay, in terms of substitution versus complementarity. And then you can also see this varies by the level of usage. So those who use it actually very frequently, you can see it's more of an equal split between substitution and complementarity, okay, which is interesting. So among that group that uses it weekly, right, there's actually a greater complementarity, but those who are occasional users, they're very much, substituting transit. They were probably occasional transit users to begin with, and they've just ditched even using that occasional transit in favor of ride-hailing. So lots of graphs here, which I am not going to go through, but you can just see a lot of these bivariate relationships in terms of substitution versus complementarity. So age, right? Young folks, more complementarity than the older folks who have used ride-hailing much more in a substitution mode than a complementary mode. You see some income effects as well. Again, more complementarity at the low income than at the higher income. Okay, so and so on. We see students, right? So here the two top categories include students, and there's a greater level of complementarity than if you're just a worker or neither worker nor student, okay? So I'll just kind of go through and just toggle through these. If you actually think that transit is reliable, if you agree transit is reliable, you're more likely, right, to consider using ride-hailing as a complementarity as opposed to a substitution. If you think transit just is terrible, obviously you're going to substitute, right? So you just see that pattern. So I'm showing this just to show you that the survey gave, reasonably decent data, okay? It's not completely inconsistent with expectations. So I like to show folks that the data is robust, okay, and just passes the sense of the common sense test before you go into your modeling, and so on. So green mode, if you're committed to using more green modes, then again, you're going to be using it more as a complementarity. And so on. So what is the impact of ride-hailing service use on bus ridership? Pretty much what you would expect. We took that sample, right, of 1747, okay, and we looked at the 55.3% for whom it made no change in bus ridership, even after using ride-hailing. 17.2% said they're using transit less. And then 4.5% said we're using transit more, okay? So take that sample and model ride-hailing service usage, right? So ride-hailing service use frequency, that's one outcome variable. And the other outcome variable is, did you decrease, increase, or stay the same with your bus ridership, your bus use, okay? So both are considered ordinal dependent variables. We put those together, right, to create a model. So this is bus use change after starting to use ride-hailing, increase, no change, decrease, ride-hailing service use frequency, weekly, monthly, rarely, which is less than a monthly. And so you can see those percentages, okay? And then here's some bivariate, okay? So those were univariate. Here's a bivariate chart. I will let you kind of look at some of these descriptives, but basically there is a bit of a pattern between the frequency of ride-hailing use and the impact on your bus ridership, okay? Increase, decrease, or stay the same. We, again, wanted to account for attitudinal constructs, right? So that's the uniqueness here that we wanted to bring in. Yes, you can always do these simultaneous equations models, just having sociodemographics affecting your outcome variables and totally ignoring the fact that there's a lot of self-selection going on by virtue of these attitudinal preferences and perceptions. Okay, so we wanted to explicitly account for these in determining the relationship between the two outcome variables. So again, a pro-environment attitude, environmental friendliness, and so on, positive perception of mobility on demand services, that is ride-hailing services, and a transit-oriented lifestyle. So we had three statements in each of these latent constructs for the latent variable model system. So there's this individual level attributes, the latent constructs that mediate, again, the impacts to the main outcome variables, which is ride-hailing use frequency, bus use change after ride-hailing. And we're trying to find what is that relationship. Here's the model estimation results. Again, pretty much very consistent with expectations. The latent variables do impact these outcome variables, and we find that ride-hailing use negatively impacts your bus use, right? So you're more likely to decrease, as you would expect, right? So that pretty much showed, even after you control for all the sociodemographics, control for these attitudinal factors, okay, the ride-hailing service use actually has a negative impact on bus use. So there is a substitution. So in other words, people are actually jumping out of the bus and into the automobile, right, into a ride-hailing service, more so than the other way around, after controlling for all of these other confounding factors. And so this, again, is a study that seems to suggest or seems to explain why ride-hailing services have been very popular, gaining a lot of momentum and market share, and why it has continued, again, to be a challenge to get people to adopt sustainable modes of transportation. So the study summary, you can read through, but basically pro-environment attitude, lower frequency of ride-hailing service use, mobility services perception is high. You have a decreased bus use because you're jumping into ride-hailing and using ride-hailing more. Transit-oriented lifestyle, you tend to be both a higher ride-hailing and increased bus use, right? So we need to really explore new ways to get ride-hailing services to complement transit. A lot of people talk about it, but there's really very few examples where that has happened in reality. So you can talk about, oh, let's do partnerships, let's integrate all the fare systems. So you pay one fare and you can get a ride-hailing ride and a transit ride, all integrated. It's all come together. You can have journey planning apps and coordinated scheduling. But again, does it work? How do you really overcome the disutility of transfers, the disutility of waiting and access time and egress time, and having to share rides with strangers and so on and so forth? So how do you overcome a lot of that is a challenge. So in conclusions, I think here's the bottom line. I think the love of the automobile cannot be denied, and I do not think it is anything that is specially or uniquely American. You look worldwide, and I think you will see something very, very similar. And despite the fact that they're probably paying like $15 per gallon, I mean, they have a much bigger love affair with the automobile than perhaps we do. So a love of the automobile. So despite efforts to shift drivers away, people still love driving. There is a certain convenience and comfort that simply comes with it. Our automobile use and travel satisfaction study showed, right, a relative amounts, right, a higher relative amount of driving for non-commute travel was actually associated with greater levels of travel satisfaction. Transit inconvenience, when given access to our car through a ride-hailing service, people are using those services instead of transit, okay, as opposed to complementing transit. And so the sustainability challenge remains, and it looks like, you've got to pair investments in alternative modes of transportation with strong disincentives for the use of the automobile. Unless you have that combination, creating a perfect storm, realizing appreciable shifts in mode shares is going to be tremendously difficult. And so really, I think now you can see why there's so much hopes pinned on the future of a transportation electrification. Because if you can't get people out of their cars, then at least let's make their car journeys as carbon friendly as possible. And that's why we've put so much stake in transportation electrification, which makes a lot of sense. I leave you with the 10 C's of choice. Maybe you can think of more C's, but hey, 10 is not bad, it seemed like a nice round number. But you really need to address the 10 C's of mobility choices, right? And choice starts with the letter C as well, right? So if you're thinking about convenience, comfort, right? Both physical comfort as well as psychological comfort, you know, the cool factor, right? The cool factor, whether it's cost effective, and time is money as well. So you've got to think about monetary cost, but also time cost. Clear, is it very clear on how to use the mode of transportation? Still, transit and so on struggle with how do I figure out how to navigate a journey efficiently using transit services. Conscientious people, you know, provide conscientious choices that are good. Connected and coordinated, provide excellent coverage, make it customizable. And again, that's why ride-hailing services are so embraced, because very customizable. And then I had to use this last word, celeritas. You know, I had to look for a word that was, you know, speed, right? Speed, it needs to be fast. Everybody's busy. And so I had to look for a synonym that started with C, and I actually found one. So that last word actually means speed. Rapidity of movement is the last C there. So that essentially explains, and it's very binary. Choice is very binary. So even if transit is almost as good, it's not quite enough, right? Because the choice is very binary. So with that, I leave you with the 10 C's. Thank you so much. Absolutely a pleasure, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rem. You know, when we used to have a high-profile speaker like Dr. Pendyala, it used to be a full room of people. Now we have a full room of teams. We got like 50 people over there, actually. So you could extend this work to shift of from a transit behavior shift to the behavior of
Sure.
like workplace to the where to work, I guess. So now I like to open the floor for questions. And I have to monitor both online and in class. So let's do this. If you want to ask a question, raise your hands virtually or physically, and I'll call your name. I see Fred's hand first. Go.
Okay, first thing is the anecdotal support of the first part of your presentation. Because I found myself during the pandemic, when I was working at home, I would just drive around my house in a 15-mile loop, doing nothing but driving, with no destination, because, you know, I missed that satisfaction, right?
Yeah,
My commute. The second point, and you know, I thought about this as you were going through, in the safety field, we found that the frequency and severity of crashes, the factors that determine those, have changed significantly from year to year. And we attribute that to changes in vehicle technologies, distractions in the car, and so on. So I was wondering, in your case, I don't know if that temporal instability is going to be such a problem, because you seem to have made a case for long-term commitment to automobiles. So maybe even with the introduction of new modes, you know, with the ride-hailing and so on, it still might be the fundamental elements might be stable over time. So you might think that when you conduct a survey 3 or 4 years from now,
Right.
you can test to see if the parameters change much over time. But I would suspect, you know, I should mention in the early 2000s, when I compared the frequency and severity of crashes, they were temporally stable back in the early 2000s. But it seems like since the Great Recession, you know, the stability has gone out the window. But I don't think that would be the case here. I think you might have really stable.
I agree. And indeed, I think the automobile has had actually greater staying power and persistence than other modes of transportation during the pandemic. So, right, I mean, if you look at the impact on transit, it's actually been substantially greater than the extent to which automobile modes have been affected. So I can fully relate to that and see indeed a greater level of stability and persistence. So there's so much inertia now in the system that bringing about a change in behavior requires a really powerful force. To some degree, I think the pandemic, unfortunately, was such a force and really changed behaviors quite substantially. But then I think in the chat, I noticed a question, based on your conclusions, what would be your key policy recommendations? And that's really a tough one, because the policy recommendations are, I think, twofold. One is, invest in alternative modes of transportation. That's great. The bipartisan infrastructure bill will do that, but that by itself, it's necessary, but not sufficient. Right? And then you want to disincentivize the automobile use. I do think that a mileage-based user fee with basically the display in your dash, like a running meter, like a taxi meter, okay, showing, every foot you drive, okay, you see this, the number changing. I think that can have a powerful behavioral effect if you actually see the pricing as you drive your miles. So I think a shift to a mileage-based user fee with instantaneous feedback can be quite powerful psychologically in bringing about change. But I will actually say, I think the policy recommendation, again, is thinking about a carbon-friendly automobile transportation system where transportation electrification, we invest heavily, incentivize heavily, and for the lower income folks so that they can embrace transportation electrification, at a faster rate than they are able to do so currently. So I would really push the transportation electrification movement as much as possible.
Thank you. Let me switch to the virtual audience. From Andrew Harmon, he has suggested another proposed C, challenge degree of physical stimulation in terms of exercise. Based on your conclusions, what would be your key policy recommendations?
Yeah, so I actually captured the second part. The first one, indeed. So C, I think, having challenging as another C, I think does indeed make sense. And that's why, bicycling and walking, there's simply physical limitations, right, in terms of what you can do with bicycling and walking. They're great modes of transportation. And in fact, those modes saw an uptick during the pandemic. People started walking and bicycling a lot more. But again, it's not going to be enough to really make a difference from an emissions and a carbon footprint standpoint.
Sure. In class? Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, I was trying to alternate. Okay, virtually from Rosu Guy and
Guy has a great question. So on any weekday workday, more workers working from home than using transit. How do you foresee this travel behavior changing in a post-pandemic world? I think it's really a question of where exactly does the hybrid work modality settle. I'm thinking that transit will continue to face these headwinds. I mean, there'll be some recovery of transit, but I think it'll continue to face headwinds against work from home, which has clearly been embraced. And I think more and more employers who actually resisted some of that and wanted everybody to come back, I think they're actually realizing that's futile, okay, to hope that everybody's going to come back 80, 90, 100%. And are really embracing a much more hybrid work modality.
So I have a couple of comments on, because I work with surveys too, and obviously there's a lot of things that happen during surveys. People have all kinds of opinions. One actually jumped out to me was because people were saying that I like to think that I'm environmentally friendly, I like friendly modes, but at the same time I like the cars. Then those are two a little bit, conflicting there.
Yeah,
so it's more about how we think about it too. Yeah. And the other one was clearly if there's alternative fuel vehicles or electric vehicles coming out, and therefore somebody doesn't have to give up the vehicle, they can just, if they want to give up a military they can just get one of those on a hybrid instead of getting the bus. Then, obviously you have that happen as well. Yeah. And I would say that, clearly you have to consider that the pandemic wasn't a good threat on the transit, obviously, because we have a lot of people in the bus, and therefore I think people wanted to be alone. Or, so I would see how they can go towards ride-hailing than transit, even though you didn't have any data, just
yeah. No, all good thoughts. Yeah, absolutely. So really, I think electrification, right, is a strategy to embrace.
Right.
But that does require a lot of players coming together, right? The OEMs, the charging infrastructure. So a lot of folks have to come together to make that happen.
Actually, that would be interesting. I know Austin is converting they have plans to convert their transit fleet and the buses to electric. So we'll see.
So you're seeing, some of those niche applications, but you got to think, 40% of the population are renters living in multifamily dwelling units and apartment complexes and so on. So how and where exactly do they charge? Right. So those are challenges we really need to be thinking about.
Great. Next is from our colleague, Sarah Hendricks. Do you think that strong disincentives to driving, such as parking management, will never be politically feasible?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a big challenge. I mean, there's very little political will to really introduce strong disincentives to driving. You can always do the small stuff that kind of makes a difference on the margins, but to do disincentives strong enough to really bring about a shift in mobility choices, I'd say in the vast majority of markets, especially in the US, I think it is really infeasible. You just don't see traction for that. I mean, where I live now in Arizona, the gas tax is like 18 cents a gallon, right? It's one of the lowest in the country. And there's just no will at all to even bring it to the national average, right? I mean, don't forget about going over the national average. Can you just get it to the national average? And there's just no drive to do that at all. So it continues to be difficult to really put in strong disincentives.
Sure. I see another question from Steve Corellas. Nice 10Cs list. I gave a presentation in the 1990s that said if you can make transit to match the speed, convenience, control, and safety of the automobile, you will win the world. Disclaimer. I am a motorist advocate.
Yeah, so totally agree, and it hasn't changed, right? So, but what's interesting is you'll often see some media articles or things in the press, that say, people are just tired of commuting, they hate driving. If only, we provided, good alternatives, people would be happy to jump out of their car and into the alternative modes of transportation. And that's what motivated us to look at this and really try and understand, well, what is, the proclivity of individuals once you control for a lot of confounding factors.
Yeah. I have a question about switching the gear to the method. So it looks like it's a linear model, but consider a multi-normal distributed variables or actually log normal distributed variables, normally distributed variables, jointly normally distributed variables.
The error terms, yes.
Yeah, the error terms.
Yes.
So I know it's speaking of the linear model. I think it's great.
So this is not linear because this is actually the latent propensity is linear, but this is actually an ordinal variable. So this is the underlying continuous measure for an ordinal outcome. So the outcome variable itself is ordinal, with, which is assumed to follow this pattern with an underlying continuous propensity, right? And so you have to estimate these thresholds right? And if that underlying propensity is between those thresholds, then you fall into a certain ordinal category.
Oh, it converts the final results to the ordinal to discrete outcomes, right? So
yes.
before that, it's linear, right? It's like
The formulation is
Formulation.
based on it's very similar to an ordered probit,
order
right?
problem.
Yeah, very
Okay.
similar to an ordered probit, except here now we have a multivariate ordered probit.
Okay, multivariate. Okay, sure. So for the linear models, it's great to predict. To describe. It's a great descriptive model to find the first order information of these relationships. But just like it's actually I'm more familiar with the car following or like control the vehicles. Sometimes when the change is mild, we use linear models. Like when we drive and we don't vary the speed a lot. But when you have a stopped vehicle right in front of us, and when we make a full stop, when we hit some limit, the linearity sort of is bending to nonlinear patterns. I don't know whether there's going to be this is more of the second order thing, that can also go to the structure of neural networks. So the difference between neural networks and a linear model like that, fundamental differences, they have lots of this kind of nonlinear rectifiers, whatever, activators.
Yeah.
So that seems like has to do with the predictability of the model. So
Sure.
I'm just wondering, that between the descriptive power versus the predictive power of this, how that this kind of nonlinearity would play a role.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I mean, of course, we try to capture nonlinearities, right? So even in a model specification of this nature, you can actually capture nonlinearities quite effectively through the use of course, dummy variables, right? But also interaction variables. So you can interact multiple socioeconomic attributes, and through those interactions, you can capture nonlinearities to a fairly sophisticated degree. Okay, so and of course, the power with these econometric models, as opposed to the neural networks and so on, is you actually return coefficients that mean something, right, and that provide you the interpretation. So I think when you're trying to explain and understand behavior, I think the econometric models are, at least for Chandra and myself, are preferred simply because the coefficients are very interpretable. You can derive marginal effects and elasticities. You can do these scenarios and see what happens. But I think indeed, if your sole purpose is to predict, right, then perhaps the neural networks and so on, and those machine learning techniques perhaps provide greater predictive power, as long as you haven't overtrained the model.
Yeah.
I should mention, I wrote a paper with Chandra that does prediction versus causality.
Oh yeah, I remember
you
that.
probably have mixing distributions in here too, right?
Yes, yeah.
So that can pick up
Non-linearities as well. Oh, absolutely.
But it is a point that presumably the best would be a combination of what would be a heterogeneity econometrics model, use that to inform some sort of machine learning model. And that's what's, I think, the next step is to have an interaction between those two. Because then you could do the big data stuff and still uncover causality instead of just being able to predict well.
Right.
So it's just
Great.
So I think the latest comments, I think I'm just looking at the chat, and I think there's some very good points there. So I should probably, do you want me to go in order, or can I just speak to the last one I see here?
Yeah, you can just
where Andrea talks about the question, it makes you think about how a second sample from cities with very rich transit, right, would compare, or how places where transit perceptions have changed would compare. So indeed, right, so this survey was done in very automobile-centric regions with strong, with not so great transit services. They have some transit, but not so great. And so indeed we find these relationships in this context, how transferable are these results to contexts where transit is very rich, right? Is potentially debatable. So that is a caveat that I want to leave you with. My sense, however, is that the results are unlikely to be all that different. Unless, again, the automobile has some strong disincentives associated with it. But I suspect that in general, the results are going to be similar, simply because if you look at a lot of transit-rich cities in the world, right, you actually do not find very different tendencies. You actually find a shift to the automobile, you find an embracing of the automobile, right? So you do see this as a worldwide phenomenon in the absence of strong disincentives for the automobile. So, but that's a very good point, and it's something we're thinking about, perhaps replicating this survey in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and some of these transit-rich environments, Washington, D.C.
Sure. I think, yeah, there are two more questions here about pricing and people's
Can
perception.
congestion pricing be beneficial as a policy measure? Absolutely. So I totally agree. Pricing, I think, is a very powerful strategy. Again, if there is the political will and the social embracing of a policy that is pricing based. So I just think that replacing the gas tax with a more mileage-based user fee with instantaneous feedback would have more of that behavioral change, can engender more behavioral change. And then I guess another would be interesting to assess how people's perception affects their decision to ride transit or not. Absolutely. And there's another C, cleanliness, totally agree. Makes a ton of sense. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
All right. Great. So I think if you still want to interact with Dr. Pendyala, you know, he has email and you know, he has a very nice webpage, so you may follow up with him. So due to the limited time, and we can end this session. Before that, I want to remind next week there will be 3 great speakers from the city, the county, and the airport, talking about you know, air-related work. And let's thank Dr. Pendyala again for the nice presentation.
Thank you.